The galactic assembly buzzed with the quiet hum of 1,000 different species communicating in their own distinct ways. Colors pulsed from bioluminescent skin, clicking mandibles echoed in rhythmic patterns, and telepathic waves vibrated in the shared mind space. Suspended platforms floated in a massive dome of shimmering starlight, the heart of diplomacy in a galaxy that prided itself on reason and logic. But reason and logic were in short supply today. The matter at hand is clear, droned Representative Clock, his crystalline body refracting the ambient glow. His voice was sharp, precise, like shards of glass clinking together. This peculiar tradition must be addressed. A series of murmurs rippled through the assembly. Members glanced at each other, many curious, some indifferent, and a few openly irritated. The issue seemed minor at first glance, certainly beneath the dignity of the assembly's time. But the Xylothian delegate, Ambassador Krex, had forced the discussion into prominence. "They name their ships," Krex hissed, his mandibles twitching in frustration. His compound eyes darted from one representative to the next, seeking allies. Not with designations, not with practical identifications, but names. Arbitrary, meaningless, emotional names. Unyielding resolve, Elysian vow, iron heart. He spat each name as if it were a curse. More murmurs. Some in agreement, others in disbelief. Primitive sentimentality. Clock concluded with a crystalline clink. Superstition has no place in the governance of interstellar affairs. Function over form. Precision over passion. That is how we endure. Captain Elias Roark leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a subtle grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. A human envoy to the assembly. He'd been silent up to this point, eyes scanning the room like a captain on the bridge of his ship. No sudden movements, no wasted effort, just patience. "Captain Roark," Clock said, his angular head tilting toward the human. "Do you have an explanation for this irrational practice?" All eyes turned to Roark. His grin widened just slightly, the grin of a man who'd seen 1,000 storms and knew exactly when to tighten the sails. He let the silence hang for a moment longer than necessary. "An explanation." Roark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished surface of his platform. "But it's not the kind you'll appreciate." "Enlighten us," Krex sneered. His claws clicked together in mock patience. "We are eager to hear the wisdom behind humanity's indulgence in mysticism." Roark's eyes locked on Krex, calm and steady. "It's simple," he said. "We name them because names matter. You give a thing a name, it becomes more than metal and wire. It becomes something worth fighting for. Something worth believing in." "Belief," Clock said with a note of disdain. "That is not logic." "No," Roark agreed. "It's not." The silence that followed wasn't like the murmurs from before. It was sharper, heavier, as if every representative in the room was trying to decipher something they had never truly considered. "You believe your ships possess agency?" asked a gelatinous being from across the chamber, its voice like bubbles rising through liquid. "Sentience, perhaps." Roark chuckled. "Oh, but you don't have to be sentient to be alive. And make no mistake, every ship that's ever pulled me through fire and fury felt alive in those moments." He looked around the room, his gaze unyielding. "When the hull groans under pressure and the bulkheads start to crack, you don't beg a machine. You beg a friend, partner. You call them by name. And sometimes they answer." "Sentimentality," Krex muttered. "Call it what you want," Roark replied, his voice like distant thunder. "But ask yourself this, Krex. When the cold void is all you see, when the only thing between you and oblivion is a ship you've spent years on, do you want to feel like you're riding a tool? Or do you want to believe you're riding with a comrade?" The chamber fell into a hush. The Xylothian's mandibles twitched, but he didn't respond. The crystalline glow of Clock dimmed ever so slightly. "You cannot ascribe loyalty to objects," Clock said at last. "No matter how many names you give them." "Loyalty, huh?" Roark leaned back again, his eyes distant, as if watching something none of them could see. You ever hear of the Morning Star? The name echoed in the chamber. No one responded, but they listened. Year 2241, Roark began. An old colony transport ship. First-generation slipspace drive, prone to failures. On its way to New Horizons 6, it got caught in a gravity shear. Hull compromised. Reactor breached. Every logical calculation said the ship had minutes before total collapse. He leaned forward, eyes sharp as knives. Captain Lena Voss did what any captain would do. She fought. She patched what she could. Sealed the compartments. Ventilated the fires. But the ship wouldn't hold. He glanced at clock, then at Krex. Know what she did next? No response. She didn't calculate probabilities. She didn't run diagnostics. She put her hand on the console, leaned in close and said, "Hold together, Morning Star. Just hold together." Roark's voice softened, almost reverent. That ship, with no AI, no sentience, and no reason to do so, held long enough for her crew to make it to the escape pods. It broke apart right after the last pod ejected. Long, heavy pause. "Call it coincidence," Roark said, voice low but firm. "Call it luck. But every spacer I've ever known would call it something else. They'd call it loyalty. Because after that day, every new ship in the fleet bore a name on its hull. The crystalline glow of clock flickered, and the bubbles from the gelatinous being slowed as if pondering Roark's words. Krex scoffed. "You anthropomorphize failure. Luck is not loyalty." "Then tell me this," Roark said, his eyes hard as steel. "When your shields fail and your engines sputter, when your fleet's too far to hear your distress call, and you've got nothing but empty space and a failing reactor, tell me you won't call on something. Tell me you won't beg it to hold together just a little longer." Silence. "Names aren't just for us," Roark continued, softer now but no less certain. "They're for the ships too. Names anchor them. They remind them that they're more than just machines. They remind us that we're not alone out there." Tla's glow dimmed once more. The Xylothian's mandibles stilled. Even the gelatinous being gave no reply. Roark rose to his feet. He straightened his jacket and glanced around the chamber, meeting every gaze with unwavering resolve. "You wanted an explanation," he said, his voice carrying across the assembly. "There it is. You name something to give it purpose. You name something to remind it and yourself that it matters, that it can endure, that it can do more than it should." He turned to leave, his boots echoing on the smooth platform. As he reached the edge, he paused, glancing back at them one last time. "Don't worry," he said. "One day, when you're out there in the cold, you'll understand." The glow of Tlaka's crystalline form shifted. Not brighter, not dimmer. Just different. Like a light reflecting at a slightly altered angle. And for the first time, he didn't have anything to say. "You think it's just tradition. A relic of the past," Roark said. His voice low but firm, carrying the weight of experience. "But that's where you're wrong. Naming a ship isn't nostalgia. It's strategy." He let that hang in the air for a moment. The assembly watched him with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and quiet consideration. No one interrupted. "Think about it," Roark continued, leaning forward. "Names have weight. They carry history, reputation, legacy. When a ship like the Resolute jumps into a system, the name alone changes the equation. Pirates reconsider. Enemies second-guess their plans. Because they've heard stories. Stories about how the Resolute didn't break when it was outnumbered 5-1. Stories about how it fought its way out of a gravity well with a shattered engine. That name becomes a warning." He looked around, eyes sharp as a blade cutting through fog. "Do you think a string of numbers and letters inspires the same reaction? Does Unit 431B7 make anyone hesitate? Well, sounds like a crate in a cargo hold. But the Resolute, that sounds like something that fights back." Clock, the crystalline delegate, flickered briefly, his glow pulsing with what might have been contemplation. "Intimidation through mythologizing," Clock stated, each word deliberate, sharp as glass. A psychological tactic, then. Roark gave a slow nod. His grin small but unmistakable. Now you're getting it. Fear's a weapon. Confidence is armor. A name does both. His gaze shifted to Krex, the Xylothian delegate, whose mandibles twitched with restrained irritation. How many of your fleets have retreated at the sight of a single ship arriving late to the battle? Was it because of the ship's specs, its hull integrity, or its reactor output? Krex's compound eyes narrowed. Tactical withdrawals are based on calculated risk assessments. Sure they are, Roark said, his tone carrying a hint of mockery. And what's the first thing your captains do when a new ship shows up on sensors? He raised an eyebrow, pausing just long enough to force an answer. They ask for its name. Not its specs, not its model. Its name. Krex's silence was as good as an admission. Because names tell stories, Roark pressed on, his voice steady, sure. And stories shape decisions. When you hear that the Unbroken is on its way, you remember the last time it walked out of an ambush without a scratch. You remember every battle report that listed it as critical damage, but operational. And suddenly your calculations aren't so simple anymore. Suddenly you're thinking maybe we wait. Maybe we don't engage today. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the assembly. Not open agreement but consideration. That was enough. Names aren't just intimidation though, Roark continued. They're rallying points. Ask any captain who's seen their crew on the edge of collapse. Exhausted, overwhelmed, losing hope. A name can bring them back. You don't shout, hold the line for Serial 7C40. You shout, hold the line for the Defiant. And suddenly they push harder. Because they're not fighting for numbers or designations. They're fighting for something they believe in. A name that means something. His eyes scanned the crowd, catching each delegate in turn. You can call it irrational. Call it superstition. Call it whatever you want. But I've seen it happen. I felt it happen. You can have the best trained crew in the galaxy, but in the moment when it really matters, when every alarm is blaring and the air smells like burning circuits, and the cold of space is just one breached hull plate away, what keeps them going isn't protocol. His voice dropped to a near whisper, carrying a quiet intensity that demanded attention. It's belief. Belief in the ship. Belief in the name. The gelatinous delegate across the chamber released a slow, bubbling sigh. You place much on intangible forces, Captain Roark. Belief, hope, fear. These are not quantifiable assets. Yeah, well, neither is courage, Roark shot back, his tone sharp. But every fleet in this room depends on it. The silence that followed was colder than vacuum.